Our next storyteller is an educator. His name is Mark Levine. Mark? Hold on a second.
Good to go? Warren, Sharon, thanks so much for having me this evening. Good evening. I'd like to tell you a short story about my family tonight. But it's not just a story about my family. It's a story about identity and persona and how those might change over time as life confronts us with challenges and opportunities. This story is about my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, my mother's father. But I have to give you a little background context first. My parents were both first-generation Americans. Their parents were part of the immigration generation. That mass of Eastern European Jews who came to the United States in the 20 or 25 years before the First World War. About 2 million people in all. And my grandfather's name was Barney Lass. He was a butcher. He came to the United States in 1905. Nobody's really certain of the exact date. In Russia, his name had been Beryl Laser. And when I'd asked my parents about how it was that their parents had come to the United States and why, they'd answer with the usual things. Pogroms, poverty, persecution, regular stuff. You know, if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, you know the story. But the story about Papa, my mother's father, Papa, she insisted, not Zadie, disdaining that more typical term, that Yiddish term for grandpa. Papa's story was different. He had to come to the United States for a specific reason. He had to flee Russia. He'd been conscripted into the Russian army. At that time, the term of enlistment for those conscripted into the Tsar's army was 20 years. For Gentiles. For Jews, it was 12 years more, 32 years in all. Not a good career move for a young Jewish guy. But more importantly, at this time, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 was raging, and the Tsar's army was hungry for conscripts. As an aside, it's actually a couple of interesting things about that war. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian power, Japan, had defeated a European power, Russia. It was also a war that was settled through mediation by President Theodore Roosevelt, who actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in 1906. Anyway, fortunately, my grandfather's family had the means for him to flee Russia. My great-grandfather, his father, was a shaman, a Jewish ritual slaughterer. He knew how to kill animals in a kosher way. But he was also a commercial butcher. And in that capacity, he held a contract to supply meat to the Russian army. Because of that contract, the family had a degree of financial stability that was unusual for Jews in Russia at that time. And also, it provided the means for my grandfather to flee Russia. So, my great-grandfather made some discreet payments in the proper places, and my grandfather was on his way to America. And that was the family narrative that I grew up with. I never really knew my grandfather. I was only 4 years old when he died. And he'd been spending winters in Florida for a while already. But we did have, courtesy of my mother, a large collection of family photographs taken over the years. And growing up, I'd go through those photographs from time to time. And one photo of my grandfather always stood out. In it, he is striding through the front door of our beach house with a watermelon on his shoulder and a broad smile on his face. He looks happy, strong, and full of life. And that was the image of my grandfather that I grew up with. At the end of my junior year in college, I was home on summer vacation. This was 1970. The invasion of Cambodia, the massacre at Kent State, still reverberated in the headlines. Protests and demonstrations, political unrest and assassinations had roiled the country for years. And I was doing my very best to provoke my parents, push whatever buttons I could, and create and contribute in my own small way to generational conflict. This was all good, clean fun for me. An experience I've relived in recent times from the other side of the generational conflict. And let me tell you, it was more fun the first time. Anyway, one afternoon, I was going on, provoking him, prodding and going on. And my mother, who usually was pretty good-natured about that stuff and took that bantering in good humor, suddenly exploded. "You're just like your grandfather," she yelled at me. "A revolutionary." I was stunned. Papa? A revolutionary? Papa was a butcher. He owned a neighborhood grocery store in Boston. My mother, her brothers and sisters had grown up working in the store. How could he be a revolutionary? I couldn't believe it. I pressed my mother for the details, though gently, not wanting to provoke another outburst. Well, it seems that most of the story, the family narrative I received growing up, was true. Papa did need to flee Russia, and his father did pay off the right people to facilitate his exit. But the reason for leaving, the motivation for leaving, was different, much different. It had nothing to do with being conscripted into the Tsar's army. That was a cover story. It seems that my grandfather was quite active in political circles in St. Petersburg. And he belonged to one of a number of political groups, associations, organizations that were agitating for change in Tsarist Russia. His particular group, Papa's particular group, was penetrated by an agent of the Tsarist secret police, the Cheka. And this agent was busily compiling a dossier on all the members of the group. If he completed that dossier and submitted it to his superior, there'd be dire consequences for all involved. Something had to be done. Well, Papa acted. My grandfather eliminated him. He shot and killed the agent before he could deliver his report. And that was what drove my grandfather to America. I never thought of my grandfather the same way again. He wasn't only the butcher born last. He was a revolutionary, barrel blazing.